attracting more buying. It would appear that some of those investment funds are coming out of the commodities and going into the stocks because of uncertainty. They haven't been as successful as they thought they would be in that situation in the commodities. They still have some there, but the index funds, so to speak, which are those that usually only buy, there are some of those that only sell, but in that situation, they originally came out of the stocks back in '05. And again, think of those hedge funds, as I want to speak, or the index funds, as coming back and buying commodities and selling the US dollar as their protection against inflation. Okay, my idea is they really don't protect against inflation, they create it by their investments and where they're at in the commodities. But the good thing about it is they do offer us opportunities. We have to remember that sometimes we get frustrated on what they do, but they do offer us opportunities. Okay, another thing that we have to watch for, as you all know, is coming next Friday. There are wonderful friends in Washington do something to get through this sequestration thing and do or not. I'm guessing they probably don't, and if they don't, we'll have to see what excitement we come up with. But you know, right now I find it interesting whether, I don't care who it is in Washington, trying to play the political part of it rather than worrying about what the country's doing. You know, we're looking at a lot of the talk of, we won't be able to kill cattle and livestock because we're going to have to take the inspectors off of the floor because we won't be able to pay them, but yet all the people on the administrative side can stay there. You know, and it's a lot of scare tactics on where we're at. Something needs to be done. I'm not sure what it is, but I don't think that'll get done until we change the political system as it sets. Also, some things that we want to look at, I think will affect us this next year would be, you know, what is our economic situation? What is that of Europe? We haven't heard a lot about Europe in the last months. Does that mean that they have their problems solved? No. It's just one of those situations, whatever the media deems it great, they'll bring it up, otherwise they'll forget about it if they don't have anything else on their agenda. The other thing we have to look at is that second one up there. We had a short crop this last year, and maybe we'll be different in history this time because of better demand in ethanol and those types of things. But in past history, whenever we had a drought in this country, you usually put the highs in at harvest time, and the market tails off all the way until the next harvest. Okay, not what you usually think, but that's where it's at. Said, will it be different this time? We've never had a drought before with ethanol out there in the bean demand the way it is, but we'll have to see. But right now, what appears that same scenario is still in effect. Demand will be there. Weather, as we all know, in this western part of the country, we're fairly dry. I think the east is pretty good, as we know, but have to see where it's at. What does that South American crop size turn out to be? We've heard of some dryness there. Not like we did last year, but there's some dryness issues. About a third of Argentina is dry, but keep in mind, it's not going to be a disaster. It just may be a record, but maybe not as big as I thought before. Still going to be a great crop down there. You know, and again, one of the other things that we look at in this whole concept is a general perception or the attitude of that consumer and the psychology of the trader on the futures market. Okay, the thing we want to look at, just as some general things that you can watch down the road. Every January, if you watch what prices do between the 2nd and the 7th of January and the 15th and the 21st, many times it will give you some ideas of where the market may go for the next 2 to 6 months. One of those time periods puts in a low, one of them puts in a high. Whichever way you break out above or below those areas, usually you'll spend the next 2 to 4 months in that general direction. Once in a while, you'll get a situation where you'll break out one way and come back and go the other way. Doesn't happen very often. This may be one of those unique years that we do that. Okay, and these are some of the numbers that we look at in here. Anybody that maybe wants a copy of this presentation or a slide like this or something, I can sure get that to you later. But if we look at corn during that time frame, 678.5 was the low, and the high was 735. All of the grain contracts are taken off of the May futures contract. I didn't want to use March because that's not going to be there a lot longer. Beans, 1347 3/4 and 1431. Both the corn and the beans have broken out to the top side, but as we know, corn's very close to the bottom of that again, so we'll have to watch and see what it does. The wheat market, 795 and 857. In the spring wheat, their numbers there, the spring wheat and the winter wheat have both broken out to the downside. Okay, cattle, 129.35 in April and 133 on the top side. That's broken out to the bottom side. Feeder cattle, again, the same thing. We have broken out to the downside. So we've got the corn and the beans that are on the upside. pretty much a lot of the other commodities went to the other side of it. We'll have to see if that will continue or what it'll do. Look at feeder cattle next in here. We do have some supply tightness, which is considered bullish. I think the thing I want to stress out here is I don't care how tight numbers get, demand will always win. Short-term supplies, you'll come back in and you will get some movement and you'll get things to go a certain way. But if demand isn't there, you're going to stop at a certain point when you don't think. And I think there's lots of disappointment in the cattle market this spring on what we've done over the last month or 6 weeks. Thinking, well, we can't go down. Well, we did. Okay, we're moving into that third turn of those people that have been buying feeder cattle and losing money. I think they're finally waking up to the point of saying, maybe I can't pay this much for feeders. Something's got to change. I'm not going to lose money every time I do this or I won't be in business. Okay, it's a great thing if you're sitting there and you're the guy selling the feeder cattle. But pretty soon if the guy on the other end isn't there to buy them, it's not going to do you much good. So we're trying to find that equilibrium right now. And spring and summer rains, I think, is still going to be important. And we've had way too many years since 2004 where someplace in this country we've had herd liquidation, and we need to stop that fairly sooner. We will be in trouble long term on what we have for supplies of cattle. What we'll do this spring, we'll find out. The southeast seems to be coming around fairly good as far as moisture. What we'll do here, I think, will be important, but hopefully we can get some of that going. Okay, the seasonal that you're watching the feeder cattle, if you're someone that is going to go out here and have something in the yard and wondering, you know, when do you need to price it or when do you need to buy something, but typically you can buy feeder cattle that second week of May and sell them that second week of August, and very seldom are you ever wrong on that one. So it's a situation that maybe you're going to put cattle into the yard next September or October, and you want to protect that possible price increase. That's something to look at. Even in years when the markets are down, it seems to work. You know, sometimes the high is going to come a little sooner than that, but you can usually make some money on that and have some protection in place. Just looking at some cycles, I do a lot of things on cycles, and sometimes people will look at it and say, well, why do those things become important? In some of these, you're going to see 18 and 20-day cycles. You know, what's the importance? It's a situation that you really look at it and say, if I need to move some product in the next month, you know, when is a high or a low due? I can try to time it a little bit, but you still want to look at those longer term cycles to get the bigger trend of where the market is going. Okay, so we got a 35-week cycle high that is due in here 3/29 of 13. So at the end of the month in here, end of next month. Now keep in mind, we did have a 45-week high that was due in feeder cattle the first week of January, and it came about the second week or last week of December. Yes.
I got a question. Let's say a guy's got some calves weighing about 500 to 700 pounds. When do you think would be the best time to sell them?
In December. No, I mean, no, I understand that. But coming into the future, I think I want to see what happens over the course of the next couple of weeks. As we go through here, one of the things that I believe in the cattle market is the end of next week, beginning of the week after, is some important timing. I'm not sure if it's going to come as a high or a low yet. If it comes as a low, I believe we may get a pretty good spurt in price into the middle of March. That 18th to the 20th area in there. And if you would get a pretty good pop, whether it be feeders or fats, I think a person may want to look at putting some price protection in place. Because I think you might have one more good leg down that could be $8 to $12 down. Okay, but otherwise, taking your point of, you know, just saying when I'm going to sell my cash cattle, when's the best time. Again, see what we do in this next week or two. If we put a bottom, maybe a couple weeks out from that might be your best opportunity until you get into May sometime.
You think they'll be better in a couple of weeks more than they're probably like 700 pounds or something better than going off to grass in the spring. They'll probably bring better money in the next couple of weeks.
The point is, what's going to come bring that point out is if you are going to go to grass, and they're going to be grass cattle, that's a different story. Okay, because the closer you get, usually the better you're going to get. The only detriment you may have there is that if they're going to go to grass, and let's say you plan on selling them the end of April, first part of May, well, what if it doesn't rain? Now you're in a world of hurt on that one. The point would be is that if your plan is to do that, and I don't think it's bad if that's the kind of cattle you have, then you may want to look, if we get a pretty good pop into sometime in second, third week of March, you may want to try to put some protection on whether it be options or futures, just in case that may happen. But otherwise, yes, if they're grass cattle, usually the closer you're gonna get, it's gonna be better, especially if it rains, they'll really pop and go, I think. If it doesn't, then you've got the risk. But otherwise, what I'm looking at this longer term, if we get some ugliness into spring, and depending on what the psychology of that buyer is on the other side, it may take us till late summer, early fall to get some real pizzazz going in that again. Just again, depending on the rains. Okay, again, 45-week low is due in early May. So that's one of the parts that bother me just a little bit there. And that's usually fairly decent. Again, that next 45-week high that we would have put in that third week of December is ideally due the middle of November. And that's really kind of an opposite time. Usually you're going to put those fall seasonal highs in between mid-August and mid-September, once in a while into October. Typically the time frame this one is coming is usually when you're putting somewhat of a fall low in. Okay, 9 to 11 week lows are due right in here. I think it becomes important. This past week, both April feeders and April live cattle took out the previous low that we had in there, but those are the only two contracts that did. And I'm thinking the reason that they did is if you watch the cattle market, if you're in somewhat of a downward trend, the second futures month becomes a whipping post out there. And that's what both Aprils are on there. They're both the second month. Now, after this coming week, when we lose February cattle, June cattle will fall into that spot. Okay, but that's the reason. If the other ones start coming down and taking those lows out, or there's other ones that, you know, get 3 or 4 contracts that are doing it and closing below it, I'm thinking you better believe the rally's over and you better put some protection in place fairly quick, because it may go fairly quickly if it does that. Hopefully it doesn't and we get some upward movement first. Okay, those numbers continue to shrink, as we all know. What I find interesting since 08 is the fact that corn really doesn't affect feeders as it used to. It used to be if corn was up big, feeders are down. Since you got the inside movement of those index/hedge funds in 07 and 08, they usually go fairly close together, which doesn't make a lot of sense. They, in 08, when the markets were going up and feeders would go up every day and corn would go up every day, you know, their excuse would really be, or the media's excuse would be, well, you know, the guy that's feeding this stuff has to make money too, so it's got to go up with it. The feeder's got to go up with the corn. Well, no, it's nothing more than they were trying to feed the train to get everybody to fall with them. If you go back to May of last year, you saw it didn't work quite so good. But for the most part, you don't get those big days when corn is down and feeder cattle up. It's still psychology of the whole trade of what they're believing in at the present time in that ag sector in general, with the exception of the soybeans. You're finding those index funds and those traders pulling out of the commodities. In like everything else the media does to us today, they've got everybody believing that are traders like that. Well, unless the funds are here buying, we can't go higher. Well, you can. You don't get those extravagant moves, but you can do it. They just got to get back to that factor again. Again, as we talked about before, those rains will be important this spring and what that pasture condition can do. It should help the price of the feeders, but if that fat cattle market doesn't come around, it's definitely going to limit it. It can't just keep going. But the biggest time we're going to find, I think, in the cattle market, and the best time we're going to find, is if we have a good attitude out here and the rains come and all of a sudden everything quits going in the feed yard and goes to pasture or rebuilding herds. We'll get some good prices as long as our economy isn't tanking in there. We looked at that on-feed report yesterday. Pretty much a yawner. We had the placements a bit higher than they thought, but well within the ranges. We look at the marketing. So the marketing number is friendly. I wouldn't believe that that report is going to make any significant news or any significant movement in that market come Monday. Maybe it's a 25 or 30 cent move, but I don't think it's anything negative or positive. If we look at some upside objectives, and again, I'm looking probably at a March and an April feeder cattle contract, 149 to 152. Now you have to go quite a ways to get there at this point in time, and that may be asking for a lot. But my point in doing that was saying I don't think you look for any more than that. Long term, maybe that 165, 170 shouldn't fall if the fat cattle come around and the economy is good and people are buying. And along with the end of the year, we had the fiscal cliff, and now we got the sequestration, and I'm sure in 2 months I'll come up with something else we have to worry about. You do that, then you come back, and they talk a lot about the payroll tax increase of that 2%, you know, that they increased but back to where it was. It might make some difference, but I'm not sure it's a huge thing. You know, we go back to that time frame when they did that a year ago. I always chuckle on that. We looked at it, and the one day when I was watching CNN or whatever it was, had a bunch of people in Washington testifying as to, you know, how great this $40 a week thing is going to be. And the one guy that, I think he lived in the Midwest someplace, Chicago or someplace, he said, well, at $40 a week makes a difference whether I can take my 2 teenage daughters out for pizza every week. And another guy on the East Coast says, well, that's going to make a difference of, you know, if I can heat my house 7 days a week or 4. And I'm thinking, you know, I do math fairly well in my head, and I'm doing it quick and saying, okay, guys, now $40 a week, what you're going to get. That means you have to be making $105,000 a year. And if you're making $105,000 a year and $40 a week is going to make you a difference, you don't have an income problem. You got a spending problem, just like Washington's got. But you heard in the media, nobody say anything about it. Now, you're trying to get everybody to fall in and not look at the big picture. Don't ask me why, but you know, I'm sure it makes a difference. But you know, if they would have told me that somebody that's making $50,000, $40,000 or less needs to get a 2 or 3% decrease in their payroll tax, I'd say, hey, great, that's a wonderful idea. But not everybody. You know, we're tight on where we're at on those anyway. Okay, looking for those significant bottoms in early April to early May. Okay, again, if rains don't develop and we have liquidation, you can see feeders down in that 122 to 132 area. Okay, which wouldn't be a pretty picture. I think those are extremes, but you don't want to take them out of the realm of possibility. Last spring when we took that break, we took lead month feeders down to 133. Okay, these are a bit tough in here to see sometimes, but I wonder if I can shift that a little bit in there. I can't, but what I'm trying to look at in here, I'm going to have to, how can I get out of this one, Chris? I'm going to have to get out of these to back into it. It escaped. Okay. Okay, good. That'll be good. Then I know where I got to go in here. I've never quite figured out that when I put charts on a PowerPoint presentation that they won't show me the whole chart. Don't ask me why. You got to come back out so you can see the prices and where you're at. Okay. And this isn't a real good look in here. Okay, I'm actually just going to skip through those when I get to them because we are otherwise not going to see what I want. Resolution isn't good enough to make that work. So the point of being and looking at those feeders was just trying to give you some ideas of a visual line. Those feeders somewhere around 165 to 170. There's going to be some fairly tough avenues. You've got some uptrend lines coming there in channels that you've traded in for about 3 years. As we look at one of those in there was an August feeder cattle contract, and that had a high of 164, I believe, earlier. We're down in that 154 area right now, so we've taken 10 bucks off. And again, can we take another 10 bucks off of there? We can. I think what we do, rains and what that fat cattle market will do will make a bigger part of that on it than anything else. So anybody have any questions on feeders before I go into live cattle? Okay. As we look at the live cattle, we do have to be aware of that fact that those carcass weights are about 35 to 40 pounds heavier than a year ago. Visited with some people a couple of weeks ago. They're in the trucking business, and they said, you'd be amazed at how many 1,600-pound cattle we're taking to town with $7 corn. And he said, you would be maybe be even more amazed how many 1,800-pound cattle. Now, you start getting to that point, you're going to really get whacked from Mr. Packer on that end, you know. And it's always been my belief that in the cattle business, if you're finishing cattle and they're ready to go, and you don't like the price, sell them. And if you think they're going higher, we'll take a chance. Buy the futures or buy your call option. But if you feed them too heavy, you're going to get whacked on what you lose in the corn and inefficiency, and also on the dock and the price. Yes, sir.
Neighbor sold some 1,000-pound feeders a couple of weeks ago, and he took a 200 hit loss he did the year before.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Why did he take it 200 bucks a head less than he did the year before? I think you got to that point in there where one, you had, let's take ourselves back into about that 10th of December till about the 20th. You had some huge buying sprees from the funds where they were taking money out of the grain markets, it appeared, and putting them into cattle. And at the end of the year, I'm guessing part of it was a fiscal cliff thing and those types of things, they started pulling their money out. And you had something change from a psychology standpoint on their standpoint, that they just said, I don't want to be involved in this right now. And then you came back somewhere into that mid-January, late January, when we were getting into this point where I talked about in the feeders, it's about the third turn for these guys buying cattle and losing money. Somebody finally woke up and says, we can't keep paying this much. And it's like anything else we do. Nothing changed from a fundamental standpoint. We didn't get any more cattle, you know, and the fat side didn't change all that much. It changed some, but not all that much. But it takes psychology change of saying, the last guy that has to buy just bought, now the top is in, and somebody's starting to sell, and if they make money, then they keep doing it. And as you look at it, as you watched over time, it takes a lot less effort for something to go down than it does up, because it's the laws of gravity. You always have to have fresh news every day and every so often to keep the market going up, but you don't have to have any news to make it go down. And that's the best explanation I'll give you. It becomes psychology, and also I think you got the guys in the cash-in starting to use their pencil and say, what am I doing? And I talked to a guy that feeds lots of cattle, and last Monday he went to Madison, and he said, that was the first load of cattle I bought in the last 18 months I could make money on taking home from the sale barn. You know, and that's not a pretty picture. I always tell people that, you know, I had cattle and I loved them, but I was usually a feeder backgrounder, but I said I would never make a good finish guy because I'm not sure I could consistently go to the sale barn and buy cattle and hope they go up and I make money on them later. A lot of times it works, but you know, if I can make it work, great. If not, I'll find a better business decision to do.
The guys that are buying, let's say guys that are buying 900-pound cattle, and they're feeding them out to about 1,300 pounds. They figure in their feed, their silage, their alfalfa. I don't know how they come out. You figure in their feed?
They don't. That's why they're changing their mind finally. Some of it is maybe a good story to do. Is a year ago in June, and one of my clients that I was talking to, and he was trying to buy cattle, buy some heifers to put out, and they were, I can't remember what they're going to cost him. I think they were like $135 or something of that nature, and they were in that 800, 850, 900 pounds. And he says, you know I'm not going to make any money if I get them bought, but I made money last year, so if I lose some this time, I'm okay. Well, I don't think that's a great attitude. You know, because you made money, you want to give it away, just because you like to feed cattle. You know, and you got to come back and get a little bit more savvy into you, and you know, and not to put anybody down, but I think of a gentleman that I knew many years ago. He told me, you know, as you look at the cattle industry, you see rich cattle feeders, but very seldom do you see a rich retired cattle feeder. You know, and his point was that somewhere along the line they're stupid enough that they lose it all they make. You know, and that's the way it is. It's a gambling thing, and I think as we get a little more sophisticated, we will look at it and say, no, this isn't working. Maybe I do it. And if we would have had that attitude for the last year or two, we wouldn't have went as high as we did in the feeder side of things last year. And I think the fat cattle guy and the guy in the feed yard would be much healthier on where he's at as a long-term thing. We go slower at when we do things, but in today's world of technology, we think of only short-term stuff instead of long-term ramifications, and I think we need to change that in our whole world. But you know, getting back to the cattle, anything else on that? We're good on that?
Yes, it sounds pretty good, yeah.
Okay, but I think psychology is the biggest thing there. Is it disappointing? Yeah. If we still look at it, is it still a lot better than we saw 5 years ago? It is. But it's disappointing. You'd like to increase a little bit each year.
Yeah, you could make, like 6 years ago, you could buy 500-pound feeders, and then you could feed them up to 800 pounds. You would make a lot of money, but now you're paying so much for 500-pounders that once you figure your feed in and you sell them, I mean, there's not a hell of a lot to gain.
No. You know, you'll get some guys that I talk to, and they will say, well, you know, I guess, you know, I think this is going to work, but if it don't, I'm just selling my corn for less. Well, is that a great deal? No, it's not.
So it's basically you're feeding them, and you're figuring your feed for nothing.
Mm-hmm. You know, and one of the fears that I had last fall with the drought was that there's so much silage cut, a lot of guys are going to go out and buy cattle because I got to get rid of this feed. Okay, but then you come back and the thought was, okay, now let's look down the road this January to March time frame. When these boys are going to be getting tight on feed and they're going to move them all to town, are the people going to be there to buy them on the other side? And that's what's happening. You know, you had this euphoria of driving it up because I got to get rid of the feed. There is one other side to that. You know, if you had to chop the silage, you didn't like it, but, you know, maybe you put it in the bag or covered it. If you didn't buy the cattle that could make money, you waited till next year and did it. Or some point, 6 months down the road when you could buy the cattle and make them work. You know, but again, that's usually not our mindset. So, okay, as we look at get back into the fat cattle again, we do have some rather limp domestic demand. And again, part of that I think we have to attribute, and maybe this also comes back to your other question of that Hurricane Sandy last fall was huge. You look at that East Coast that has got some pretty good money in it, and they're out eating all the time. And if you lose restaurant business, you don't get it back. It isn't like you get a storm and the freezers go down and you throw the meat away and you're going to replace it. You just don't replace that demand. And that hasn't come back, and there's still lots of problems back there today as far as trying to rebuild and do things. The exports these past 2 or 3 weeks have went from a normal 15 to 16,000 tons a week down to about 9 to 11. We had a great report yesterday. It popped up to 22,000. We've had lots of talk of this Japan 30-month of age thing is going to do great things for us. Okay, keep in mind the cancellations the last 3 weeks in beef were Japan. Now, is that 30-month age restriction going to change what Japan's going to buy? No. If you look at the current age that we had before, they didn't buy all the beef they could have bought under that age limit. Okay, it's nothing more than probably 8 or 10 years ago when China was going to join the WTO. Everybody said, look at how much higher our grain prices are going to go and our stuff is going to go. Well, I happen to have one of my customers, they visited his farm out by Mount Vernon, and he visited with him and said, you know, from your aspects, you know, you're going to greatly increase what you're going to import from the U.S. and other countries if you become a member of the WTO. And their answer was no. We may if we need to, but our real goal is to be able to have your technology so we can be self-supporting. Okay? So we have to look at these things, and the media may tell us one thing, or somebody may want you to believe something, but you got to look deeper into it. Is it a bad thing that we increase that age limit? No. You did the same thing when South Korea came back. Okay? Keep in mind the political pressure these countries get from our country to do it. So they come back and they say, yeah, we'll do it. Doesn't mean they're going to buy anymore. You look at the South Korean situation before 2003, they've come back a little bit of what they bought. But first of all, their people want to support their industry before they import from the U.S. And 75% of what South Korea imported from the U.S. was ribs. And today they still will not take boned-in beef. Okay, so until that comes about, you're not going to increase the exports there greatly. Okay? So the last one on here is the seasonal price decline. When you get in that spring time frame, and it may start in January, it may start in April, every year is different. But when you get that spring price decline, it averages about a 13% decline from the top. So if you look at April live cattle, which were just shy of 138, that would take them down to 120 before they're done. If you look at May feeder cattle, that were somewhere 159.75, that take them down to 139 before they're done. So it's just something that happens year in and year out. The higher we go, the more downside we can have. And we just have to keep that in mind in what we're doing. Do we hope it doesn't happen? Yes, we do. But from a reality sake, keep in mind, this is something that can happen. So if I'm coming in and I'm selling in that spring time period, there may be some points in time that you need to do some protection. Whether that's to come back if you're in the feeder side of things, that you're using futures or options, or maybe you're coming out here in November and you're selling your cattle in the video auction for March, April delivery. Wherever you're most comfortable, whatever one seems to work the best at the time. I think you have to look at that video auction as a viable alternative. If you're sitting there and you think you want to put some price protection on, look at what the futures and the options may do to you. Look at what recent sales on that video are doing. If all of a sudden the recent videos are $7, $8 above what you think you could contract for the futures, that's the way to do it. Look at all the tools you have out there and use each one to the best of its ability each time. In the same way with the fats. If you've got something in those time frames and you see something coming, do something if you're going to sell. If all of a sudden you're going to sell later and you're in the time frame where you should be past that spring decline and things should be in the upswing, then you can take some more chances. And it all gets to the point also, you know, agriculture has had, the last 4 or 5 years have been wonderful and built some good equity. The one thing you have to do is be careful to preserve it and don't throw it away. Because if somebody thinks the 1980s and high interest isn't coming back, it is. Just a question of when it does. And it gets ugly when it gets there. I was fortunate enough when I went through those days that I didn't have much money borrowed, and you could buy some things and take opportunities, but if you were leveraged like a lot of these guys were, it hurt. Okay, 45-week low due March 1st. There's a 26-week low due at early May, and that 9 to 11 right in here. So when I look at those three right there, it tells me that short term in here, I could be putting some type of a low in. I might get a 2 or 3 week pretty good run up in the market, then I should have one more shot down. Ideally, probably into that mid-April to the first week in May. Okay, again, fall prices should rebound, I would guess, in here, but again, economy and what corn prices do. And I don't think corn prices are going to affect the fats near as much as they do the feeders, but I think the economy and the general well-being, perception of beef and all those things, and we've been fortunate over the last 10 years to have a much better perception of meat in general than we used to do. That Atkins diet did a great thing, and research and development is a great thing, but I've always been somebody that doesn't like it real well because they'll tell you one thing and 10 years later they'll tell you something else, so they keep their job, they keep doing it. And you just wonder sometimes who you can believe and who you can't. Okay, and again, as you look at cattle, is part of this weakness the past 3 or 4 weeks had something to do with the Russian ban on cattle coming in, fed ractopamine? Yes, ractopamine, yes it is. How much, I don't know. But you got to look at, Russia isn't a huge importer of our products, but just that perception from the trader standpoint can make a huge difference on whether they're going to say they want to be buyers or they want to be sellers. Just to throw some quick break-evens out here, an 800-pound feeder somewhere around 131. I'm using the cost of gain of about 115, 4% shrink and death loss in there, break-evens of 130. When I go to October futures, that's about where it's at today. So you can come out, if I'm going to be a cattle feeder and I'm going to buy cattle, is it the worst thing if I buy feeders today I can do it and I can break even? No. I'm just not sure I want to be one that I have to have a $5 to an $8 or $10 come to make it work. In my estimation, if I'm in that situation, I'm a lot better off to let somebody else feed them, sell my corn and buy the cattle futures, because that's the only way I'm going to make money is if it goes up. I don't have to feed it. I don't have near the risk. I don't have money tied up. I realize, yes, you may have feeding situations out there. You may have feed, you may have equipment, but if you're going to lose money doing it, it still isn't much fun. Yes?
I can't remember if it was China or Japan. They bought, I don't know how many 100 metric ton of beans in the last week. Is cattle going to follow that or not? Or there's been a lot of ethanol plants closed down south, and the corn price, what's that going to do with that? And it's kind of all supply and demand pretty much.
But basically, who's canceled the beans probably 3 weeks ago was China. China, in the bean market, China's a one-trick pony there. And things can change quickly. When you got all those cancellations the next week, they were canceling because the crush was not good. They weren't making any money. 10 days later, they're making great money, so beans go up. About Thursday, all of a sudden, the crush was not making money anymore in China. So you've got lots of emotions, and one of my colleagues, I think, put it the best. And he talked about the Chinese. He said they may be godless communists, but they're good traders. And I get bothered, and I'm still trying to do some investigation of saying, okay, so you bought this stuff. Why should you be able to get out of a contract that you purchased? I'm trying to get how that works, but those things are tough. I've been of the belief, and hopefully you guys are too, that you make a deal with somebody you live with. If it was wrong, it was wrong. But it's part of, I think, the perception of, boy, we don't want to torque off the guys buying from us and go someplace else. Well, if everybody did it, I'll be in the same point. You wouldn't have to worry about it. But it's kind of like watching a lot of games get played on some of those things. But to come back and try to totally answer your question, are they going to keep canceling and what are they going to do? I don't know. We'll have to see. China, when we look at the bean situation, if beans rally, you'll say, well, China bought 6 cargoes of beans today, or did this. keep in mind, just as a normal realm of business, China has to buy 14 to 18 cargoes a week just to keep their supply in line. So if somebody says they bought 6, is it a big deal? No, it's just normal business. Just the idea of how will I trade it? Will I buy it from the US? Will I buy it from South America? Those types of things. You know, but China, I don't think, is a huge influence in the beef side of things. They are huge in the pork side, but not in the beef. But they are a big factor in beans. And in corn, they may or may not be. They've bought huge amounts of wheat this last week. And again, think about it. If you're going to buy corn at this price, which is, you know, just using the futures today, somewhere around $7, and you're looking at wheat that's somewhere around $7, I can go to Australia and buy feed wheat and have a lot less shipping bill than I'm coming to the U.S. or South America and buying corn, because it ain't cheap to get corn out of South America when you got to go through the Panama Canal. And those things, where they're at.
This might be off the subject, but let's say down south they get all kinds of rain and they plant a lot of corn. Let's say they plant all kinds of corn down south and we get all kinds of rain. What do you think the corn price is gonna do?
Question is, you know, if it rains down south and it doesn't rain down here and they plant right in here, but it get lots of corn planted in the south, what's corn going to do? First of all, I think you have to look at the total picture of what that total crop will be. But again, I think you have to look at the fact that I started on in saying that in a short crop year, prices usually go down, okay, in default. So I would think unless you get some really dry things and you get things similar to last year, that you can get some declines. How far that goes will have a lot to do what ethanol demand does, what export demand does. You know, what's some worst case scenarios that you look at in there? Probably in that 4.25 to 4.75 futures. You know, can it get worse than that? It can if things really die, but I'm not sure you do a lot more than that at this point in time. And as we get into some numbers later when we're talking in the grains, you'll see some scary numbers that we get out of our friends in Washington on what the carryout can do, and it doesn't take long to build corn up, especially if demand doesn't come around like you'd like it to. Okay, I'm going to buzz through these again because we can't see what we want. Any questions on cattle, period, before we move on to hogs? How many hog guys we got here? Anybody? In case there's some out there, we'll do a little bit in here anyway. Export demand on hogs, unlike cattle, becomes a little more significant. We export about 8 to 12% of our beef. We export about 20 to 25% of our pork. Okay, U.S. producers haven't liquidated. We saw that in that December report where everybody knew that with the corn prices last fall and those types of things, that we did liquidate hogs. We had lots of hogs coming to town. Yes, we did. It was a short-term situation. Many of those you had in this part of the country. There's probably a couple of large producers in this part of the world that did it, but most of them shut down temporarily to come back and remodel. Now they're back up and running.
They remodeled, big, bigger, better, and faster.
You got it. You got it. You know,
3 barns made 1. And
yep. And that's what's killing us in here. You know, it's, you come back and there's always enough of a carrot out there to, hey, there's profit out here. If you look at the hog guy, typically he's going to make money from probably May through August, maybe early September. The rest of the year he loses money. But there's enough profit there to keep him going. And you looked at last fall again, and even into probably a month ago, you had hog prices for summer in that 100 to 101. Now they're down to 92, which you'll see in a minute isn't profitable. You know, but until we come back, and again, part of the reason for these guys not cutting back, especially in Iowa and those areas, is what they're valuing that fertilizer at. But you know, it's
fertilizer is valued at $100 to $150 an acre.
Yep. You know, so you look at those things and you say, okay, it's good, but make sure you're doing all the math and it still works for you. You know, if it doesn't, it's no different than we talked about in the cattle thing. You can't fool yourself ever. You got to use real numbers in there. But that's the biggest point for them not doing it and keeping us up. And again, as technology grows, they become so much more efficient, so many more pigs per sow per litter that they're getting. You know, it all makes a difference. You have a question?
I talked to a trucker, and he said he had to haul 2,000 head of, I think it was butchers, pigs, down to IBP per day just to make their quota or whatever. And how they getting rid of that? I mean, is the U.S. eating that up, or is it overseas, or what?
Okay, the point was this for
It's
the,
coming from Canada, I think.
yeah.
I think it's coming
Can
from-
those guys hear those questions good enough, Chris, or do I need to repeat those?
No, you're all right.
Okay, so as we look at it, the US is using some, but if you look at US pork demand, it has backed off. And part of the reason that you'll look at it is we've done a great job as producers making it leaner. But as we've done that and put some of the growth hormones and things into it, we've also lost flavor, which the US consumer has backed away from. Some of the foreign people haven't yet, but you'll wonder if they don't. So it's like everything else we do, we can, where's that happy equilibrium at? Because if you don't have flavor and good flavor, people aren't gonna buy it. You can go back to the time, I love pork loins. I'll put them on the grill, season and do it, And then you can go to places that somebody's going to serve you pork loins that they put in an oven. Why don't you just give me a pork roast? It's the same thing. It's flavorless. It really is unless you do something. You gotta, the grilling or something is great, but again, people still like beef. You get the other countries that are a little bit economically and maybe not quite as advanced, they're gonna eat those cheaper cuts and do those things. They're gonna eat the poultry and the pork more than here. We talked about last fall, we're going to have a bacon shortage this summer. Well, I found it interesting that, we're talking about having a bacon shortage, but how many restaurants and chains all of a sudden coming out with bacon on more things? Well, something doesn't make sense here to me. But again, we come back now, and as we're coming through and finding out we have more hogs, you don't hear them talk about it anymore. So we'll see, but I think one of the biggest things is, yes, the US is down on demand, other countries are good, but as you'll get to in a couple minutes in these slides, is that about Wednesday or Thursday, China did come out and say, we may start putting some restrictions on ractopamine on pork coming in to China. And if they do that, that won't be pretty. And then you come back and the industry can sit here and talk and say, okay, well, what do we have to do to satisfy your needs? In other words, is this a political ploy that if we come back and we say we'll do this, then you make the restrictions more, or is it some reality that you really don't want it? I think if you look at the efficiency of what we do here compared to what they do in China, the cleanliness of what we do here versus China, it's scary, From a Chinese economic standpoint, it would make much more sense for those people to come back and import our processed pork than to take beans over there and grow it themselves. But therein lies the problem. They want to be self-sufficient. They do not want to rely on someone else. We haven't got smart enough to figure that out yet. Okay, and many things that we're doing, selling it to other countries and stuff. So that's why they're willing to be a little bit less efficient in things, because they want to be there and not worry about depending on someplace else if something changes in the political climate out there. Okay, seasonal lows are usually in that March to early April. Last summer we talked about the heat and how it was going to affect the breeding. Didn't do anything. Wasn't a problem whatsoever. Last spring, I think when I was here, we did the presentation and we talked about the National Pork Congress of how much PRRS problems there were here and there and everywhere. Well, it was there, but something happened to offset it because it didn't seem to make any difference.
That's because you're looking at from 10, 15 years ago, an 8 to 10 pig average, now you're looking at 12 to 13.
Right. Yep.
Clean average.
Yep. And I think you're right. That's where it was in there. So you got to look at those. And again, that ractopamine thing, you have to look at that both in Russia and China. So you got two forces there. Keep in mind, we probably export twice the percentage of hogs as we do beef. Okay? Okay, some break-evens. Looking at in here, I think I'm fairly close on most of this. So we're looking at futures at 92.50, break-even at 93. That's coming into the summer months. It's not profitable. Yeah, maybe corn goes down or this happens or that happens. So the only justification, this is a time period where those producers usually make money. So we have to be looking at it from a fertilizer standpoint in there more than anything. And hopefully that keeps working. I mean, we don't want to see them go down. It's great for the country. You're producing food and creating jobs, and that's great. But you just hope you don't run yourself out of business and all of a sudden it gets to be like the cattle industry is, where we have much more bunk space than we got cattle to feed. Do we have too many hogs for what we're going to consume and what we can export? And we can go, I'm not sure if many of you guys were around in 1998, but it got really ugly in that situation where you had more hogs than you had kill capacity. wasn't a pretty sight for a little while.
About what, 8 cents?
Yep, about 8 cents, you're right. And that really came back, and, you know, that's where you really got rid of the last of the independent to do things. And you just don't see those huge fluctuations. Well, the price is good now, these guys are gonna get back in. Now, if you're there, you're there. If you're not, you're not. And the other part of it is, you guys are well aware, today's world would rather work 6 months out of the year than 12 months out of the year. Rather be a grain farmer than a grain and livestock farmer. You know, you have to like livestock, and you have to want to do it. For those of you that are in it, especially in the cattle side, it definitely does grow on you. You know, it's kind of like your family when you're out there and work you put into it.